A successful businessman encounters prejudice at an elite bank, leading to a lawsuit that reveals hidden biases, tests relationships, and forces all involved to confront their assumptions about identity and redemption. How will this conflict be resolved, and what conclusions will the characters come to? Let's find out together. It was 10:45 when I arrived at the bank. Weston and Company, nestled at the corner of Franklin and Maple, had this old-world charm to it, with its brass doors and marble floors that smelled faintly of polish and money. Banks are funny places when you think about it, arenas of quiet judgment. Every suit and tie, every manicured hand tapping a phone screen, silently screams of wealth and power, or the pretense of it. I wasn't planning to spend more than 10 minutes there, just a quick deposit and out. That was the plan. But the second I stepped through those heavy brass doors, I felt the shift. You know that sensation? When something feels off, like the air's charged with something you can't quite put your finger on? That's what it was like. The first thing I noticed was the man at the counter, early 30s maybe, tall, lean, with a kind of restless energy about him, like he didn't quite belong in the hushed, orderly world of Weston and Company. He wore a black jacket, a little frayed at the cuffs, and a plain gray hoodie underneath. His hair was damp from the rain, droplets still clinging to the edges. He wasn't the kind of person you expected to see here, in a place like this. And neither, apparently, did Morgan. Morgan, she was the teller at the counter. Mid-40s, sharp-edged, the kind of woman who always seemed like she was waiting for an opportunity to prove she was smarter than everyone around her. She wore her authority like armor, and in that moment, she was using it to size up the man in front of her. "I told you," she said, her voice clipped, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "This isn't the kind of bank for transactions like yours." The man frowned, his hand tightening around the envelope he held. "I'm not sure what you mean by that," he said, his voice steady but with a hint of frustration. Morgan leaned forward, her manicured fingers tapping the counter. "This is an investment bank. We don't deal with untraceable cash deposits." That word, untraceable, hung in the air like smoke. The man blinked, as if he wasn't sure he'd heard her correctly. "It's not untraceable," he said. "It's business revenue. I'm here to deposit it into my account." But Morgan wasn't convinced. I could see it in her eyes, the way they narrowed, calculating, already deciding who this man was before he'd had the chance to explain himself. "If you're running some kind of operation," she said, her voice lowering conspiratorially, "this isn't the place for you. I didn't mean to get involved. I really didn't." But something about the way she said it, the way she looked at him, it made my stomach turn. It wasn't about the money or the bank. It was about him. She wasn't seeing a client. She was seeing something else. A stereotype. A threat. A walking assumption. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," the man said, his voice firmer now. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a card. "I'm the CEO of Apex Consulting. This is legitimate business income." Morgan didn't even glance at the card. "Anyone can print an ID," she said. "I've seen it all before." That's when it happened. A small crowd was forming now, drawn by the tension in the air. One of the senior bankers, a man named Terry who I'd seen a few times before, stepped out from his office. He looked between Morgan and the man, his brow furrowing. "What's going on here?" Terry asked. "This gentleman," Morgan said, her tone dripping with skepticism, "is trying to make a cash deposit, but I don't think his business is above board." Terry frowned, stepping closer. "What business?" "Apex Consulting," the man said, handing the card to Terry. "We've been clients of this bank for 5 years." For a moment, there was silence. Then Terry's face changed, the recognition dawning like a sunrise. "Wait a second," he said. "You're James Conway, the CEO." "Yes," James said, his patience clearly wearing thin. "I've been trying to explain that." Terry's expression darkened as he turned to Morgan. "You didn't verify his ID?" Morgan stammered. He doesn't look like what?" Terry said, his voice sharp. "A CEO? A legitimate client? One of our biggest accounts?" I didn't stay much longer. The confrontation escalated, with Terry berating Morgan for her assumptions and James finally able to make his deposit. By the time I left, Morgan was being escorted out by security, her career likely over, and James was in Terry's office, receiving the kind of apology money can't buy. But as I stepped back into the rain, the whole thing stayed with me. The way Morgan had looked at James, the way she'd decided who he was before he even opened his mouth. It wasn't just about her, it was about all of us. The quiet assumptions we carry, the ways we fail to see people for who they really are. I don't know what became of James Conway after that. Maybe he went back to his life as a CEO, no worse for wear. Or maybe that day left a mark on him too, in ways none of us could see. But for me, it was a reminder, a harsh, necessary one, that the world isn't always what it seems, and neither are the people in it. When I left the bank that day, the rain had only gotten heavier. It pelted the sidewalk in rhythmic bursts, soaking my shoes as I stood at the curb, waiting for the light to change. I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd just seen, about Morgan's face, stone cold, resolute, as she doubled down on her assumptions, about James Conway, standing there with his ID in hand, his patience stretched thinner than the cash he'd come to deposit. It wasn't my business, I told myself. People like Morgan exist everywhere, don't they? They make up their minds long before they've heard the truth, their judgments carved in stone. And James, well, he'd walked out of that office with his dignity intact and his account in good standing. So why did it bother me so much? Maybe it was the way Morgan had tried to explain herself, her voice trembling as Terry's anger grew. I didn't mean anything by it, she'd said, her words hollow even as they left her lips. It's just, you never know with these types. What did she even mean by that? Was it his hoodie, his rain-slicked hair, or was it the fact that James didn't look like the kind of man who'd stroll into Weston and Company, his name printed on the door of an executive suite? Whatever it was, it had been enough for her to write his entire story before he had a chance to tell it. The light turned green, and I crossed the street, the rain soaking through my jacket. In the back of my mind, a thought took root, small and insistent. Was Morgan the only one guilty of that? The next time I saw James, it wasn't at the bank. It was 2 weeks later, on the corner of 5th and Harmony, outside a little diner that always smelled like bacon grease and burnt coffee. I was there for a late lunch, nursing a greasy sandwich, and staring blankly at my phone when I spotted him through the window. He was standing at the counter, holding a to-go bag in one hand and scrolling through his phone with the other. He didn't look like the man I'd seen at the bank, the one who'd stood his ground, fire flickering in his eyes as he fought to clear his name. Today, he just looked tired. I don't know what made me do it, but I stood and walked to the door. Before I could stop myself, I was outside, calling his name. James, right? He turned, his brow furrowing as he looked at me. For a moment, I thought he didn't recognize me. Then his face softened. From the bank, he said. You were there. I nodded, suddenly unsure of what to say. I wanted to say I'm sorry for what happened. James gave me a faint smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. You weren't the one who called security on me. No, but I was there, and I didn't do anything to stop it. His eyes lingered on mine for a moment before he shrugged. You didn't have to. It wasn't your fight. Maybe, I said, but it wasn't Morgan's fight either, and she sure made it hers. He let out a short, humorless laugh. Fair point. I hesitated, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. Can I buy you a coffee? I feel like I owe you at least that much. James tilted his head, studying me like he was trying to figure out if I was serious. Then he shrugged. Sure, why not? If you like the story and would like to support the channel, please subscribe to the channel and tell us what country you are watching from. Over coffee, I learned more about James Conway than I ever expected to. He told me about Apex Consulting, how he built it from the ground up after leaving a dead-end corporate job in New York. They called it a career track, he said, his voice tinged with bitterness. But it was more like a treadmill. No matter how hard you worked, you stayed in the same spot. So he quit, poured everything he had into his own business, taking on contracts nobody else wanted. It wasn't pretty, he admitted. I worked out of a basement for the first 3 years, lost more clients than I gained, but eventually, things started clicking. Now, Apex Consulting was a multi-million-dollar firm. They specialized in logistics, helping small businesses streamline their operations. Most of our clients don't even know we exist, he said with a wry smile. They just know their shipments arrive on time. Sounds like you've built something incredible, I said. He shrugged, but there was pride in his eyes. It's not about the money, he said. It's about proving people wrong. My whole life, everyone's looked at me and thought I didn't belong. I wasn't going to let them be right. His words lingered long after our coffee cups were empty. There was something in the way he said them, this quiet defiance, a resilience that felt earned. It made me think about Morgan. about her quick judgment and the way she'd dismissed him without a second thought. But it also made me think about myself, about all the times I'd done the same thing without even realizing it. It was a week later when the first crack appeared. I was back at Weston & Company, sitting with my banker and discussing some tedious account details, when I overheard two employees whispering near the corner of the room. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but their voices carried just enough to catch my attention. "Did you hear about the lawsuit?" one of them said. "Yeah," the other replied, their tone hushed. "Something about that Morgan situation? Apparently the guy's filing for damages." My heart skipped a beat. James. He must have filed the suit after what happened. Part of me thought he was justified. Morgan's behavior had been appalling, and if anyone deserved to face the consequences, it was her. But as the weeks went by, the story took a darker turn. Rumors started to spread, whispers about James's business practices, about questionable contracts and allegations of fraud. None of it was confirmed, but the air around his name began to change, growing heavier with doubt. I reached out to James, hoping to clear the air. We met at a park this time, the autumn leaves crunching beneath our feet as we walked. I asked him directly about the rumors, half expecting him to dismiss them. Instead, he sighed. "There's some truth to it," he admitted. "Early on, I cut a lot of corners to keep the business afloat. I'm not proud of it, but I did what I had to do." "And now?" I asked. "Now everything's above board," he said firmly. "But people don't forget. They don't want to. It's easier to believe I'm still that guy than to admit I've changed." His words stung in a way I didn't expect. Because he was right. People didn't forget. And once they'd made up their minds about you, it didn't matter how much you'd changed. After our conversation at the park, I couldn't stop thinking about James's admission. He hadn't tried to sugarcoat it or spin it into something noble. He'd owned his mistakes. But the weight of his past hung heavy over him, casting shadows he couldn't outrun. And now, those shadows were starting to stretch toward me. The rumors about James weren't just whispers anymore. They'd made their way into news columns and social media posts, accompanied by vague accusations of mismanagement and fraud. The headlines didn't outright accuse him of anything, but they didn't need to. The insinuations were enough. I found myself defending him more often than I expected. At a dinner with colleagues, someone mentioned the rumors, their tone laced with disdain. "You know that guy's bad news, right?" one of them said, swirling a glass of wine. "Apex Consulting? They've been shady for years." "Do you know that for a fact?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. The colleague shrugged. "Where there's smoke, there's fire." I hated that phrase. It was an excuse to judge without evidence, to believe the worst because it was easier than digging for the truth. But even as I argued, a small, nagging doubt crept into my mind. What if James wasn't telling me the whole story? I decided to see for myself. James had mentioned the Apex office during one of our conversations, a modest space on the outskirts of town, tucked away in a nondescript business park. I called ahead, pretending I needed consulting services, and scheduled a meeting. The office was smaller than I expected. No sleek glass walls or fancy reception desks, just a few desks, a coffee machine in the corner, and a handful of employees typing away on laptops. It wasn't the image of a multi-million-dollar company, but it felt real, honest. James greeted me with a firm handshake, his expression flickering with surprise when he recognized me. "Didn't expect to see you here," he said. "I wanted to learn more about what you do," I said, "and maybe clear the air." He studied me for a moment before nodding. "All right, come on, I'll show you around." As he walked me through the office, explaining their operations and introducing me to his team, I couldn't help but notice the respect in their eyes when they spoke to him. These weren't people working for a con artist. They believed in him, in what he was building. It was hard not to believe in him too. 2 days later, I got a call from James. His voice was tight, strained in a way I hadn't heard before. "I need to ask you something," he said, "and I need you to be honest." "Of course," I said. "What's going on?" "The lawsuit," he said. "You've heard about it, right?" I had. Morgan had filed a countersuit, claiming defamation and emotional distress. She was accusing James of using the discrimination incident to smear her reputation and damage her career. It was a bold move, considering her dismissal was a direct result of her actions, but she seemed determined to fight back. "I need you to testify," James said, his words rushed. "You were there that day. You saw what happened." I hesitated. It wasn't that I didn't want to help him, it was just complicated. Testifying meant stepping into the middle of a legal battle, putting myself in the spotlight, and part of me couldn't shake the doubt that still lingered, no matter how much I wanted to trust him. "All right," I said finally, "I'll do it." The courtroom was colder than I expected, the kind of sterile, impersonal space designed to strip away emotion. Morgan sat at one table, her lawyer beside her, exuding an air of righteous indignation. James sat at the other, his shoulders tense but his gaze steady. When it was my turn to testify, I took a deep breath and stepped forward. The questions came quickly, each one designed to paint a picture of that day at the bank. I recounted the events as clearly as I could. Morgan's assumptions, her refusal to verify James's ID, the way Terry had stepped in to clear things up. Morgan's lawyer tried to poke holes in my story, questioning my objectivity and my motives for supporting James. But the truth was simple, and no amount of legal maneuvering could change it. Morgan had made a judgment based on appearance, and it had cost her dearly. When I stepped down, James gave me a small nod, a silent thank you that spoke volumes. The case dragged on for weeks. Each new development splashed across headlines and dissected in op-eds. Morgan's countersuit fell apart when emails surfaced showing a pattern of discriminatory behavior toward other clients. The bank settled with James out of court, issuing a public apology and promising to implement new training programs to prevent similar incidents. For James, it was a victory. But as we sat in his office the day the settlement was announced, he didn't look like a man who'd won. "What happens now?" I asked. He sighed, leaning back in his chair. Now I rebuild. Again." "You've done it before," I said. "You can do it again." He gave me a faint smile. "Yeah, maybe." In the months that followed, life slowly returned to normal. James poured himself back into his work, focusing on building trust with his clients and strengthening his team. The rumors faded, replaced by stories of his resilience and determination. For me, the experience left a lasting mark. It forced me to confront my own biases, to question the assumptions I carried without even realizing it. I started paying closer attention to the people around me, their stories, their struggles, their humanity. James and I stayed in touch, meeting for coffee now and then to catch up. Each time, I left those conversations feeling a little lighter, a little more grounded. He'd become more than just a passing figure in my life. He'd become a friend. 1 year later, on another rainy day, I found myself back at Weston & Company, staring out the same window where it had all begun. The city outside was the same, gray and relentless, the rain turning the streets into rivers of light. But I wasn't the same. Neither was James. We'd both weathered storms that could have broken us, and we'd come out the other side stronger, more certain of who we were and what we stood for. As I stepped outside, the rain soaking through my coat, I couldn't help but smile. Sometimes the hardest moments lead to the most unexpected growth, and sometimes all it takes to change your life is a chance encounter and the courage to see it through. The day after the settlement, I visited James at his office. It wasn't a planned visit. I just felt like I needed to see how he was holding up. When I arrived, the usual hum of activity was missing. The front desk was empty, the lights dimmed. I found James in the conference room, sitting alone with a cup of coffee, staring at a stack of papers on the table. "You okay?" I asked, stepping inside. He looked up, his face drawn. "I thought winning would feel better," he said. "You did win," I reminded him. "The bank admitted fault. They paid out." Morgan's countersuit fell apart. James nodded slowly. "Yeah, but the damage is already done. My name's been dragged through the mud. My company's reputation is still recovering. And for what? All because someone looked at me and decided I didn't belong." I didn't know what to say. He was right. The victory was hollow in some ways, and the scars from the fight would take time to heal. "Do you regret filing the lawsuit?" I asked. "No," he said firmly. "What Morgan did, what the bank allowed, it needed to be called out. If I hadn't fought back, it would have kept happening, to me and to people who don't have the resources to push back. But, he sighed, "it's exhausting, always having to prove myself, always being the exception instead of the rule." The words hung in the air, heavy with truth. I thought about how easy my life had been in comparison, how rarely I'd had to fight for recognition or defend my place in the world. James's exhaustion was something I'd never experienced, but I could see it, feel it in the way he spoke. "You shouldn't have to prove yourself," I said. "Not to them, not to anyone." James gave me a faint smile. "That's easy to say." harder to live by. The lawsuit had broader consequences than either of us anticipated. The settlement became a talking point in business circles, sparking debates about bias in corporate environments. Some called James a trailblazer for standing up to institutional discrimination. Others accused him of exploiting the situation for personal gain. It was strange, watching people who didn't know James speculate about his motives. They painted him as either a hero or a villain, with nothing in between. But the truth was more complicated. James wasn't perfect, he'd admitted as much, but he was trying, and that, I thought, was more than most people could say. I started noticing changes at Weston & Company too. They introduced new diversity training programs and made a public commitment to improving their hiring practices. On the surface, it looked like progress, but I couldn't help wondering if it was just damage control, a way to polish their image after the scandal. One day, out of the blue, James called me with a proposition. "I've been thinking," he said. "Apex is growing, and I need someone I can trust to help steer the ship, someone who understands what we're trying to build." I frowned, unsure where this was going. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I want you to come work with me," he said. "Help me take Apex to the next level." I was stunned. "James, I don't know anything about logistics." "You don't need to," he said. "I've seen how you think, how you handle people. That's what we need, someone who can navigate the big picture." It was tempting, I'll admit. My job at the time was stable, predictable. But it didn't challenge me, didn't excite me the way James's offer did. Still, it felt like a risk, a leap into the unknown. "Let me think about it," I said. In the weeks that followed, I spent more time at Apex, getting to know the team and learning the ins and outs of the business. The more I saw, the more I realized how much potential the company had and how much it reflected James's values. He wasn't just running a business, he was creating opportunities, giving people a chance to succeed where others wouldn't. Eventually, I made my decision. I handed in my resignation at my old job and joined Apex as a strategic advisor. It was a strange transition, stepping into a world so different from what I was used to, but it felt right, like I was finally doing something that mattered. James and I worked closely in the months that followed, building partnerships, expanding operations, and rebuilding the company's reputation. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks, challenges, and moments of doubt. But through it all, we kept pushing forward. One evening, as I was leaving the office, my phone buzzed. It was a number I didn't recognize, but something told me to answer. "Hello? Is this Ethan?" The voice was unfamiliar, hesitant. "Yes." "Who's this?" "It's Morgan." I froze, the name hitting me like a jolt of electricity. "Morgan? How did you get my number?" "I asked someone at the bank," she said quickly. "I hope that's okay. I needed to talk to you." I didn't know what to say. After everything that had happened, Morgan was the last person I expected or wanted to hear from. "I don't think we have anything to talk about," I said, my voice colder than I intended. "Please," she said. "I know I don't deserve your time, but I just need a chance to explain." There was something in her voice, something raw and unguarded. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet her. We met at a small cafe on the edge of the city. Morgan looked different from the last time I'd seen her. Tired, deflated, like the weight of the world was pressing down on her shoulders. "Thank you for coming," she said as I sat down. "I don't know what you want from me," I said. "If this is about James." "It's not," she interrupted. "Well, not entirely. I need you to understand. What I did that day, it wasn't about him, it was about me." I frowned, unsure where she was going with this. "I've spent my whole life trying to prove myself," she said. "Growing up, I was always the outsider, the one who didn't belong. And somewhere along the way, I started seeing threats where there weren't any. I made assumptions. I lashed out. And I hurt people because of it." Her words caught me off guard. I'd expected excuses, justifications, but what she offered was something else, vulnerability. "I know I can't undo what I did," she said, "but I want to make it right. I just don't know how." Morgan's admission stayed with me long after our conversation ended. It didn't erase what she'd done, but it offered a glimpse of the person beneath the armor, a person who was flawed, yes, but trying to grow. When I told James about it, he was quiet for a long time. "Do you believe her?" he asked. "I think she's sincere," I said, "but that doesn't mean she deserves forgiveness." "No," James said, "but maybe she deserves a chance to earn it." Life didn't magically fall into place after that. James and I continued to face challenges at Apex, navigating the ups and downs of running a growing business. Morgan, as far as I knew, took a job at a small credit union, starting over in a place where no one knew her name. But through it all, one thing became clear. People aren't defined by their worst moments. They're defined by what they do afterward, by how they choose to move forward. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I was moving forward too. If you like the story and would like to support the channel, please subscribe and leave a comment. I'd be very pleased.